Jamie Cornelius. She's an integrative biologist at Oregon State, just down the highway. And she's going to talk about the fascinating subject of wandering the world with nomadic finches.
Okay, thank you, Harry, and thanks to you all for having me. I think Audubon groups are my favorite groups to give talks to because there's always just inherent curiosity about the birds, and which is what it's all about. So let me share my screen and then go into presentation mode here. That's good, everybody?
That's good.
Okay. All right. Well, as Harry mentioned, I'm part of the Integrative Biology group at OSU, and I had the, I guess, fortunate timing or maybe unfortunate of joining the department about 6 months before COVID hit. So I haven't gotten really to meet a lot of the bird community yet, but I'm hoping to in future years. So in any case, I'm going to talk to you today about nomadic finches, and I want to start by talking a little bit more broadly about migration in general. So why do birds migrate? And I can cheekily say because they can, but really that's part of it. The fact that birds are highly mobile, and so they have the luxury of being able to actually move to a different location for whatever reason. And there's a lot of animal species that can't do this, and they're constrained, in other ways. But birds can. But on a broader level, why would you as a bird choose to move? And there's some obvious reasons. You could be trying to avoid this. This was actually taken in Portland during one of the big ice storms. You could be taking advantage of this. Huge insect booms, and bioproductivity in the north is really large in the summer, and so you can take advantage of those resources, with the flip side of having to deal with the winter or fly away. And so migrants are kind of moving north to make use of those pulses, and then moving south to avoid these wintering conditions that are so difficult to find food in. There's also hypotheses that migrants are avoiding competition or minimizing competition by moving to other places. And then also, we don't often think about daylight and the hours of day as a resource, but day length is a resource for a diurnal species that needs to be able to see to do its job. And if it's feeding young, then a really long day gives it a lot of time to do that in. And so as you move further north, you get longer and longer days, which is what this graph is showing. If you can't read it, it doesn't really matter. It just means that day length is changing across latitudes, and birds are actually minimizing the amount of darkness that they experience by migrating. They migrate north when there's long days, and then they migrate back south to have longer days in the winter. So day length, I think, can't be overlooked as a driving force for migration. So in sum, birds are trying to avoid death and maximize reproduction. And this is what we define as Darwinian fitness. And the birds that do this best will pass on their genes to the next generation and persist in the population. And this is a really common strategy. 1 in 5 species of bird migrate, and I think that's probably a pretty big underestimate because there's many birds that we're discovering are partial migrants. You mentioned the MODIS network, and the more that we track animals, the more that we understand we really don't know as much as we thought we knew about some of these species. There's a lot more movement than we were necessarily aware of. And I think in large part, the partial migrants were the ones that were kind of hiding that until the technology was around to reveal it, that some of the individuals will move and migrate to show a true migration, but other individuals will stay. And so that becomes more difficult for people to notice unless you're doing a lot of banding or have radio telemetry efforts to be able to follow individuals. But the arrival of spring migrants really symbolizes spring to a lot of people. I'm sure you are all very aware when one of your favorite spring migrants, you first hear it, you say, oh, they're here, and they actually are a pretty good indicator of conditions and how early the spring is going to happen, etc. And I chose a red-winged blackbird for this because I grew up on a farm in Southwest Washington with a lot of red-winged blackbirds around, and they really, if I hear red-winged blackbird, I'm just taken immediately back to my childhood. It just makes me feel like home. And they're the first dialect that I ever heard because I went to graduate school in California. And I heard the red-winged blackbird singing there, and I was like, that sounds like the voice of a red-winged blackbird, but it doesn't sound at all like the red-winged blackbirds I know. And my advisor told me, well, you're hearing a dialect. I thought, wow, I can actually do it. So that was exciting. Anyway, now I'm a bit of an enigma. My graduate advisor calls me because now I can tell the cross ecotypes apart, but I'm not otherwise a generally informed auditory birder. So I'm learning, but it's, as you all know, it's a lifelong pursuit, those kinds of skills. Okay, but migratory journeys are not easy. Some birds, like the Arctic tern, is literally circumnavigating the globe twice a year. And a lot of birds are making journeys across vast oceans or deserts where there is no opportunity to stop and refuel and get more food. They really have to do it right the first time or they're going to die en route. And so this is a pretty strong selective event for birds. And there are just some incredible stories out there. The Arctic tern is one of them. The bar-headed goose flies over the Himalayas. This is 21,000 feet at elevation, and they are exercising. They're flying, which is actually a pretty metabolically expensive mode of locomotion. It's much more expensive than walking. And whereas us humans are, using supplemental oxygen just to walk or crawl up to these heights. And even for birds, which have pretty efficient lungs, and are able to extract a lot of oxygen from the air because of the way that their lungs are organized, it's still kind of a metabolic conundrum how these birds can do this. So they've been a target of physiology, which is one of the things that I'm really interested in, is how animals adjust their physiology to survive in environments. And a number of years ago, I was at Stanford's Hopkins Marine Lab for a talk, and by Jessica Meyer. And she is actually an astronaut now. She's this incredible woman who's done all this amazing stuff. But she raised bar-headed geese and purposefully had them imprint on her so that she could then ride a moped motorcycle with the geese flying behind her, and she trained them to fly very close to her so that she could attach oxygen masks to them and have a tube coming off of that to equipment that was on her bike, and she could actually take metabolic measurements while the goose was flying next to her on this bike. So she could take them at different speeds. I mean, it was just absolutely incredible what she was doing. So anyway, that's just a cool story I thought I'd share on the research side of things. The Bartailed Godwit is another superstar that has the longest nonstop flight that is known. So they fly for 9 days straight without stopping for water or food, and they cover 11,000 miles. They go from Alaska to New Zealand in 9 days. So for many birds, stopover sites are really important, and those are great for birding. You see lots of birds at these stopover sites. But it means that those stopover sites are really important for refueling, and if those become changed, I guess, by humans, which is kind of the most often thing that happens through pollution or development, then it's really a problem for many of these migrants. But the Bartailed Godwit doesn't stop. It goes all the way through. And even short hop migrants like this white-crowned sparrow that fly from, say across a kind of continent wide, but stay over land. So they make what are called short hops. They'll fly overnight and then stop and feed during the day. And then they might fly right again the next night, or they might feed for 3 or 4 days or a week until they have enough replenished fat stores to do it again. And they'll hop up to their breeding site. But they do there's even for those guys where they have access to food, and if they need to land, it's not the end of the world most of the time because there's land on which to stop. There's still a really big advantage for these migrants of being among the first to arrive at a breeding site. And you think about this as a home court advantage. If they can establish a territory early on, then they're more likely to keep it when other individuals arrive and try to fight them for it. And so there's a big advantage in kind of breeding success to be early and to start. And part of that is how short of a time they have to produce young in places like in the far north, in Alaska, for example. There's a pretty short window of time where they can raise young and still have time to prepare for the autumn migration to return. And so they're really under a lot of pressure to get there quick and to get there on time and healthy enough that they can start breeding. And so these migrants will make preparations for these flights. And so if you haven't ever blown the feathers apart on a bird and looked, the skin on songbirds is so thin that you can see right through it. And that's really convenient for physiologists like me because you can then score actually what's happening in the bird. So here's a breast muscle that doesn't have a lot of fat. There's a little bit of fat here at the kind of underside of the keel. And then the intestines are under the skin here. And in a migrant, depending on their strategy and how far they need to go, they'll load fuel, they'll load fat. And fat's a really lightweight fuel. It's the most efficient fuel. And so migrating birds will deposit a whole bunch of lipids, a whole bunch of fats. And you'll see them there, and so you can score kind of how much fat they're laying down. And they store those fats by overeating. It's called hyperphagia. And if you've seen sparrows in particular doing this, they're just little machines, they're just moving across the ground, just so focused on foraging. You can get really close to them because they're very, very focused on overeating to get enough fat for their migratory journey. They also build the muscle, and there's a lot of changes in kind of cellular physiology and blood physiology that allows them to get ready for transporting all that energy through the blood and getting it to the muscles where they're going to need it during this long flight. But of course, being heavy, building muscles, storing fat, this is also expensive for birds. They need to fly, and so they're going to have to carry all that mass in the air. And so migrants will hedge their bets. So they'll lay down enough fat for the anticipated journey, but not so much that they're carrying too much extra weight. So that there's a pretty strong selection on birds to carry kind of just the right amount of fat, enough to get them through, but not so much that they have extra costs. And so what you'll see is that migrants that need to pass large barriers like oceans or deserts will carry more fat than migrants that don't. So here's a beautiful picture of a ruby-throated hummingbird. And this species, you can think about these tiny little hummingbirds, almost double their mass before they fly across the Gulf of Mexico. Others may not fatten much at all and instead take an overland route, and they feed along the way. And so there's different strategies that you can see both across species and even individuals in some species. And then generally, we tend to see that juveniles, the first-year birds that have never migrated before, they don't tend to fatten as much. So there's some people who are interested in whether or not fattening is actually a learned trait as well as a genetically programmed trait. And that the juveniles, when they experience their first migration, will learn that they need to carry more fat. I think this learning component in juveniles and migration in general is going to be centrally important for adaptation to climate change. We're already seeing a lot of migratory route shifting. I think there was just a paper published about European starlings starting to show east-west migrations in Europe instead of north-south, and they think this is a climate adaptation. And birds are remarkably flexible in this migratory behavior. So I think it's one of these traits that is really probably going to be pretty important to helping birds cope with climate change. So the preparations take time. Migrants are preparing for migration far away from their destination. So how do you know when to go if you're, 11,000 miles away from your breeding site? You can't say, oh, conditions are good, now I can go, because you have no idea what those conditions are. And so birds have, they've evolved internal programs that help to tell them when it's time to get ready and to start eating and laying down fat. And this is a fancy graph showing, this is the entire year down here from day 1 to day 365, and across latitudes. And it's just showing how different latitudes experience different day lengths across the year. So I've put a blue bar here at about the where we are, kind of northwest Oregon. And so you can see in the winter, we have relatively short days, about right around 8 hours of day length is our shortest day. And then our longest day happens in the summer solstice there, with right around 16 hours of daylight. And so depending on the latitude you are, you can experience differing degrees of photoperiod. And even at the equator, there are small changes in either day length or in how light is polarized that birds can use to know what time of year it is. And so those changes in day length will trigger internal processes in the bird that tells them to start eating and that instructs the body to start storing fat and to get ready for this migratory journey. So then how do they know where to go? And this is, it turns out there's both genetic programming. So birds will generally have an idea of where they need to go, what direction they need to go. But there's also a lot of learned components. So the young are probably imprinting on habitat type. And in fact, some people at OSU have found that if you play the songs of the adults of that species, the young will imprint on either the correct, or if you put them in the incorrect, they'll imprint on the incorrect habitat if they heard the songs of their adults. So they're really using environmental cues to say, yep, this is the right kind of place. So when you come back the next year, this is the kind of place I'm going to find. That's what the juveniles are kind of experiencing. And then in general, they're using a lot of different tools to be able to find their way. There are internal maps, celestial cues, light polarization cues, magnetic cues, olfactory cues. All of these things are allowing birds to sometimes be incredibly precise in their homing to even a particular bush or a particular porch if you happen to be a barn swallow. So sometimes it's just mind-boggling that we used to study white-crowned sparrows in the Sierra Nevada, and we'd have birds that would come to the exact same territory every year, and we knew they were wintering in Baja, in Mexico. I mean, it's just absolutely amazing. They come back and find the same meadow. They're just really good at this. But there are some dangers of this kind of programming, and birds aren't super rigid in this, but the ones that are more rigid may be more at risk in this. So this is an example of a study in great tits in Europe. This is Marcel Visser's group in the late 90s, documented how the timing of the insect period, right here, this caterpillar peak, was shifting because of climate change. It was shifting earlier. And he was finding at the time that the birds had not really adjusted when they arrived on migration, and therefore when they could start laying nests and then having their young, which is kind of the peak need for food. And so what was starting to happen is that the timing of the caterpillar peak was mismatched to when the nestlings were needing those caterpillars. And so there was starting to be a decline in fitness. What you can expect in a system like that is that the birds who just happen to come later might start to kind of win out in the fitness war, and their young, which might also happen to come later if it's genetic, will help that population to persist. The question is, how much time does a population have to make those adjustments? And how big is the change in the insect peak? If this is 4 weeks different, then the birds aren't going to be able to adapt to that. But if it's slow enough, and we can curb our emissions enough so that that change is slow enough, then maybe we give birds a fighting chance to adapt to the changing timing of things. So migration is necessary for survival and reproduction, especially if we're going to take advantage of some of these habitats that have a lot of resources. But it's also expensive and full of risks. And birds can improve their chances of success by using day length to predict the timing of the movements and to prepare by storing fat and building muscle. And shifting patterns of resources might be a challenge for some species. And that's what I want to now focus on in the next part. And specifically, I want to focus on some of the things that I think about, which are what types of adaptations might help birds to survive and reproduce when resources are not seasonally predictable. So when there's not a known peak in the spring of your food, how do you cope with that? And understanding those adaptations might help us to understand the general toolkit that birds have to respond to changes in their environments. And so for this, I've been thinking in particular about the birds on the right, the red crossbill, but there are these species that have oftentimes actually kind of been lumped together, the zebra finch and the red crossbill, as these kind of ultimate, kings of flexibility, that these birds are so well adapted to having unpredictable resources that they are entirely opportunistic. They can breed whenever there's resources. And of course, the story is much more nuanced than that. Each species has a unique story that matches its particular environmental challenge. And I'm going to very quickly talk about the zebra finch and then a little more detailed about the crossbill. So zebra finches are arid adapted. Zebra finches, so they've become kind of the lab rat in the bird world. And the reason why is because of their unique ecology. They have become basically programmed to breed whenever the resources are there. And so they're very willing to breed in captivity. If you give them food and water, and especially green grass, they will be very happy to produce young, even in captivity. So they've become a very popular lab bird because of that. They're very easy to get a lot of zebra finches. And I find that fascinating, first of all, that we're kind of basing a lot of our genetic and all kinds of different studies on this bird that's actually pretty unique. But also cool that we've somehow our lab approach has, I think, inadvertently kind of capitalized on this phenomenon in birds, where if they live in a hard place, and then all of a sudden there's some resources for a little while, that we can then take advantage of that in the lab and in the research setting. So anyway, zebra finches are arid adapted. They live in actually kind of all over Australia, and they show some differences depending on if they're in a more kind of wet coastal area or the really dry interior. But I'm going to focus on these dry interior birds. They're pretty impressive because they can go without water for very long periods of time, as in like months. And in the lab, you can keep them on seeds only. And they're so efficient at getting water out of their diet that that's okay. But they can't migrate without water. And so a lot of these birds in these communities have pretty low mobility. They really can't go find anything better. And so because of that low mobility, they're really an obligate opportunist. They're just kind of waiting it out. And sometimes they might have to wait 1.5 years for there to be a rain event. And they won't breed until that happens. But then when there's a rain event, there's an incredible green up that happens, and they will immediately start breeding. As soon as the green grass is there to support it, they will breed, and they will keep breeding nonstop, round after round after round, until those seeds are gone. And I don't remember the longest known kind of reproductive bout in zebra finches, but it was over 1 year. So they were just producing young continuously. And that is a really unique strategy. That's a real they basically give it their all as soon as they can. Crossbills are different, of course. They're lumped with them in a lot of of the historical literature. But they're a northern bird. They're living in, a very wet habitats. So first of all, that's quite different. And of course, as you probably all know, they're adapted to conifer cones, and we have different ecotypes. I've just put 2 up here. This is a 3, so it's got a thinner bill. You can tell kind of relative to the head shape. That in this big, thick-billed bird, this was actually one that I caught in Russia. But really thick bill, almost its entire head is bill. And these birds are adapted to much bigger, harder cones. And these birds are adapted to small, papery hemlock cones. And so they can eat a wide variety of foods, but they're constrained by their bill. So this is a bird in captivity. I think it's a type 2 feeding on a Douglas fir cone. And it's just nice. These captive birds give us an opportunity to get a really clean video. They enjoy these cone days. You can see them kind of prying. They really use a prying. You can see that right there at the end there. They have really asymmetrical musculature, and they use that to pull the jaws laterally. So they pop them open, and then they stick their tongue down in to get the seed out at the base of the scale. And so they're really efficient at this foraging technique, and they're highly specialized. So they're not as good at doing some other things, like catching insects or feeding on other types of seeds. Although we think that insects are pretty critically important during the migratory season for them. They're oftentimes moving through habitat doesn't have cones. So the thing about conifer seed crops is they're different than kind of a typical seasonal seed that we see in the general seed bank, where the cones are produced fairly predictably in the late spring and summer, and then they develop. So they start out kind of green and hard and closed. And crossbills are really the only species that can feed on them in this state. But then the cones develop and they start to open, and the seeds will start to disperse. And that's when a lot of other species like siskins and all kinds of things, right? Chickadees and nuthatches will start to eat those. And then the seeds can remain in the cones through the whole winter. And so this is, crossbills have become so good at this and so efficient that they can take advantage of large seed crops and pull off both a deep winter and a late summer breeding season. So they're typical of other finches in that they breed later in the summer because they're feeding seeds. But then they can breed again in the winter. And I've done a lot of work on kind of metabolics of this in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. So it's -10. And I would be running around on snowshoes in a huge down jacket just to stay warm. And they're raising young. It is absolutely incredible that they can do this. So the question is, or in my mind, are crossbills obligate opportunists like the zebra finch? So will they breed continuously when resources are available? And I'm going to quickly go through some of the data, but the short answer is no. And this has been a myth that was perpetrated in the literature and is, I think, still kind of persistent in the bird world, that crossbills can breed whenever. And it's just not true. We have scoured the literature and done 30 years of field work, and they just don't breed in the fall. So here's Germany study. Here's a study in the Pyrenees. Here's a study, so we're generally looking at testis length or ovary condition. So it's just showing you when the value's high, they're able to breed, and when it's low, they can't. They don't like these testes, for example, are too small to produce sperm. So they're physiologically not possible breeding. And these are our data from, and by our, I mean, my kind of dissertation data and beyond, and then my advisor, Tom Hahn, who studied these birds for 20 years before I did. And so anyway, we have now well over 2,000 crossbill captures in North America, almost all in Western North America, and over 33 years. And we haven't caught a single or found a single instance of breeding in the late fall. So November, December. And one problem is that a lot of people say, oh, well, there's young. But young crossbills are dependent on their parents for several months. So that's not a very good indicator that they're actually initiating new nests in the fall. This testis data, our female ovary data, and then all of our observations just really suggest that they don't breed in the fall. Here's an example where they stopped breeding in Washington. This is a wild population, even when seeds were still really abundant in the cones. So here's Western hemlock cone abundance, and the seed abundance in the cones, and the seeds start to disperse in kind of October into November, and then they start to get low across the winter. And you can see that the testis length is dropping especially from August to September and October, even while these seeds are still really available. So it's not just a food thing for these birds. They also wouldn't breed in captivity with all the food that they wanted, but they would at other times of the year. So the question is why, if there's food and they are flexible and they're able to breed in the deep winter, why not breed whenever there's food? And so we have two hypotheses. One is that the adults need to stop breeding in the fall so that they can focus their energy and their efforts on preparing for the winter. So, and in that sense, building healthy, good, strong feathers. New insulation is built at this time of year, and also metabolic restructuring. So the body goes through a lot of changes from summer to winter that allows them to deal with the really cold temperatures in the winter. And that might take a lot of energy, and they just might not be able to do that very well if they're investing in young at the same time. Another hypothesis is that maybe the young don't actually survive that well if they're hatched from fall initiated nests. And so we have these two kinds of hypotheses, and crossbills. As I mentioned, the young are dependent on their parents for the first month out of the nest while they learn how to forage. This was actually a juvenile crossbill that I caught at one of our most productive field sites in Grand Teton National Park, was at the sewage treatment ponds. As I know that that's a popular birding place too in many places. It was the effluent coming out of that had been treated. I think it was just full of nutrients, and the birds loved it. There was a lake 200 meters away, and they weren't going there. They were coming to this spot, so we would catch them here. And this was a little juvenile that I banded, and then when I let him go, he flew 20 feet away and started foraging in this tree, and he let me get really close, which is a very crossbill thing to do. So anyway, they become fully independent, so they're fed by their parents while they learn how to use their bill. They're not very efficient at first. They drop cones all the time. You can watch them doing this, and they're just not very good at it. So their parents will feed them for about a month out of the nest. So it's possible that they are not initiating nests in the fall because it's going to be, 2 to 3 months later when those babies are having to support themselves. And 2 to 3 months later puts them in the coldest months of winter. So if they started a nest in November, then the young would be becoming independent in February. That's a pretty hard month to meet your first independence in feeding, and trying to stay alive and meet those demands of being warm-blooded and tiny in a really cold place. So it's possible that that's the case. And one of the ways that I looked at this was just looked at how many females were initiating breeding. In other words, had a fairly early stage brood patch. And then what would be the temperature that they would experience in different developmental phases. And so the dark bars just show the average temperature that would be experienced by fledglings. So if the females initiated a nest in October, the fledglings would experience -2 degrees Celsius. And so what you can see is that the months down here in the non-breeding months, November, December, October, November, October, December. These are the months when they choose not to breed, and these are the months when the young would experience the coldest temperatures. As soon as you get above 0, you start to get some months where the young would, or where females actually do initiate breeding, September, and it's just a little bit warmer for the young. February, so that's a really cold month to initiate a nest, but by the time the fledglings are out of the nest, it's warmed up a bit. And then March and July, you can see it gets warmer anyway. So this suggests some evidence that there is at least a correlation between when they choose not to breed and what the temperature would be like for the young if a nest had been initiated in that month. But fall is also a time for molting and preparing for winter. So this is just the schedule of molt in crossbills, and you can see there some of them are starting as early as July, but mostly they're molting in August, September, and October, and they're finishing in November and December. And that's the flight feather molt. That's these feathers when they're growing their primaries and secondaries and tails and whatnot. The body molt actually happens a little bit later. It really peaks in October. And actually over here with this heat map, you can kind of see that the most intense phases of body molt are happening mostly in October. And this is one of the months where we see the least amount of breeding. So there's evidence that both of these things might be influencing their breeding schedules in crossbills. And overall, we find that crossbills are not the same type of opportunist as zebra finches. Crossbills we're calling rich patch exploiters. They have high mobility, they can move to find new good patches of seeds, and they take breaks for self-maintenance, so they don't breed in the fall. Zebra finches have low mobility, they have to sit and wait for better conditions, and they will just breed continuously if the conditions are good. So 2 flexible strategies where there used to be one. A rich patch exploiter with high mobility that really allows for prioritizing self over reproduction in some seasons. And then the obligate opportunist that really has to prioritize reproduction over self whenever possible. And so what I'm going to move into now, we still have some time, is about this kind of high mobility of crossbills and tie it back into the migration story. So this shows 2 different years of cone crop development in a hemlock. And what we find generally in cones is that they are the cone maturation, the first development of a cone crop, is temporally predictable. So it always kind of happens in the late spring, early summer is when a cone crop will start to appear. But it's not spatially predictable. They develop in kind of big massed crops, and say Western Washington will have a really great fir crop, but the next year it's Alaska, or it's Michigan, or it's Central Oregon. The cones are not spatially predictable, and so crossbills are nomadic, and they will fly in late spring or early summer to find a new cone crop. So if these are seasonally predictable, these nomadic movements to find new cone crops, might they also use day length, like regular migrants do, to prepare? And so what we found over the years in captive and wild studies is that in this study, we're just showing that captive crossbills here peak in their fat deposits in June, and that's coincident with when we think they move to find new cone crops. And here's wild data peaking in May and June, again, coincident with when we think they go to find new cone crops. And when this was a study that I did during my dissertation, we more recently incorporated more data and actually had comparisons across other finches with house finches, goldfinches, and siskins, and found that the amount of fat deposition really correlated well with predicted migratory patterns. And so here's crossbill breeding season, spring migration, and then another breeding season, and then a fall migration. And this migration we think is much more facultative, so they sometimes move and sometimes don't. But we see that the fat deposition is really mirroring their migratory season, and that's it's important because what you would expect based on just kind of thermoregulation and the risk of starvation is you would expect that birds in the winter would carry as much more fat than in the comparatively much warmer spring. But here we're finding that it really doesn't track thermoregulation, it tracks migratory costs. And even if you look at the different crossbill types, which we've only more recently been able to do, the fat loading really matches the expected migratory behavior of the different ecotypes. So here we have types 3, 4, and 2, which are all showing spring fattening, and they are all expected to be nomadic. Type 3 especially, and you can see that here's the type 3. It's showing the highest fat loading in the spring, and they're foraging on these really papery, tiny cones that show really strong masting patterns. So there'll be a huge amount of cones and then nothing. And so it really reflects their migratory strategy. Whereas type 5s, these are the types that occur in the Rocky Mountains. And they're feeding mostly, well, they feed on a lot of different things. But one of the cones that they're well adapted to are lodgepole pine. And those have actually fairly consistent cone production. And so they're not expected to have to move as far or as often as the other crossbill types. And we see that in their fattening. And in fact, this is the pattern we would expect if it was more about thermoregulation. Than the opposite. So when timing is predictable, they seem to be making use of day length as an important cue. And we actually have captive experiments now where we found that photoperiod drives fat deposition in crossbills the same way that it does in seasonal migrants. And that the amount that they're loading is really commensurate with what they think, what they typically need during a migration. Okay, so I have more stuff, but I'm wondering, Tim, do you want me to go on for a few more minutes or should we stop?
No, I think you should finish up. Harry?
Yes, yeah, go right ahead. We only have a couple questions, so keep going.
Okay, and I will not be offended if people need to go do other things. So, okay, so the other side of the coin, you've got seed development, but then also once the cones open up like this, they start to drop their seeds, and that's good for the trees, or they're dispersing their seeds, but it's bad for the birds because now they're no longer available for crossbills to eat. And so the rate at which those seeds fall out of the cones can be very fast and short. In other words, the crossbills could kind of experience a big decline in seed availability even as quickly as the fall, or they can be kind of a long, protracted dropping of seeds, and so the crossbills can have them for much longer. So when there's a sudden drop in the seed availability, this can induce what's called an eruptive migration, where it's more of kind of an emergency response to an unpredicted change in conditions, and this is often food. And every single species could theoretically have to do this if the food got really bad, or the conditions got difficult. Storms, fires, there's a lot of reasons to have to make an emergency migration. But these kinds of movements are particularly frequent in boreal species that are responding to these masting crops of seeds. So they're going to move in kind of big waves with these seed availabilities. But I always like to point out too that this is not just a bird problem. Even humans make eruptive migrations, and oftentimes under extreme duress, and they take huge risks to try to find someplace better. And this is really risky for birds too. You could imagine having to move through huge habitats with not a lot of food. That's why you're leaving in the first place. And the questions are, when do you leave? When do you decide to pull the plug and take this risky long distance flight Where do you go, and how do you prepare? And so this whole nother arm of my research is about these kinds of questions. And one of the things that I study in this context is the stress response and how hormones in the body can respond to environmental cues and help birds to cope. So we oftentimes think of stress hormones as being bad, that they hurt us, but really stress hormones are highly conserved across vertebrates, and they exist to help animals cope. And of course, there are problems when things get out of whack and you have chronic stress. That's a whole nother ballgame. But in the short term responses to environmental challenges, these hormones are really important. So you get a stressor, this lightning bolt to the brain, that would be a stressor. And then the brain initiates a hormone cascade that ends with, in birds, corticosterone, and in humans, it's called cortisol, which you may have heard of. And these hormones redirect efforts in the body, so they're going to induce energy storing cells like fat cells to release energy into the blood so that muscles and the brain have a lot of energy to cope with this stressor, and also promote survival and push things away from reproduction. So the sex, breeding, territoriality, these are all things that are not going to be important in the context of a big stressor. They're really going to this hormone is going to push those decisions and behaviors towards survival, finding food, escaping, hiding. There can be lots of responses, but this hormone is thought to help animals coordinate this. And if you take crossbills in the lab and you food reduce some of them, then you see an increase in these stress hormone levels. And this is thought to be adaptive and to help them to cope. One of the things, though, that I've been very interested in for animals in general, but especially crossbills, is these birds are highly social, extremely social. This is how you find crossbills most of the time. And of course, when they're breeding, they're in pairs, but even then, they are communally foraging. They're not territorial, and I think they're making decisions together. I think there's fairly stable groups in small flocks, at least, and they move together. And so they're making these decisions together. And so in this experiment where I found food restriction to affect stress levels, I wanted to test how social cues might affect that. And so I basically gave these birds that were going to be food restricted a neighbor. And the neighbor either had a lot of food, so it was giving basically kind of the opposite, it was experiencing the opposite thing that the focal bird here was. Or I gave them a neighbor who was also food restricted. And then I measured the stress hormones. And it mattered. So the birds that had a food restricted neighbor and basically the social information agreed with their own assessment of the environment, this low food, they had a much stronger release of stress hormones. Then the same bird, so this bird had the same physiological stress. It still had the same amount of food as this one, but its neighbor was well fed, and that actually attenuated the stress response. They responded to that. And when I repeated this study to try to understand more about the mechanism, why, how this happened, we did some studies in the brain and found that social experience, so a bird with a food reduced neighbor actually had different brain physiology than the birds who had a well-fed neighbor. So social information, what their neighbor was experiencing, was actually affecting their brains. And I love the thought experiment of bringing this up to humans, thinking about the people who you surround yourself with and how they might be affecting your brain. But anyway, so we had a hypothesis that this was actually adaptive and that the birds who were getting social information from a neighbor who wasn't getting enough food, and we think these are probably vocal cues, birds that aren't, so in these treatments, we just give them food for certain amounts of time a day. So instead of having food all day, they have food for, a few feeding periods a day. And that effectively makes them think that food is unpredictable. even though they could theoretically eat a lot of food. And so when we do that, they vocalize a lot, and this stuff happens in the other birds that are listening. And so I wanted to ask, does that help them to cope with food if they then become food restricted? So to this point, they're just listening to their neighbor. And so what I did was did a similar food restriction, but I either gave a social information from other restricted birds before they got restricted or at the same time. So the social predictive means that their neighbors were warning them for 3 days. Food's bad, food's bad, food's bad. And in this other group, they got social information, but at the same time. So there was no difference in timing for the restrictions in that group. And what we found is that the controls didn't change mass either after 1 day of restriction or 3, but the birds that had warning also didn't, so they didn't have a significant difference in mass. They lost a little bit of mass there, but it wasn't significantly different from controls, whereas the birds that didn't have warning lost more mass. And that held after 72 hours of food restriction, where the birds that hadn't had warning were losing more mass than the birds that were warned. And remember, again, this is the same restriction. And so in that study, we looked at all kinds of different things, food intake and activity. But one of the most fascinating things, I don't usually do terminal experiments, but I was flummoxed, we'll say, as to how they basically ate about the same amount and they were about as active. There were small differences that could have made a little difference in the mass. But in general, there was a 50% larger mass loss in this group, and I couldn't figure out why. And so I ended up looking inside a small number of each of these groups and looking at the intestines. And what I found is that the birds with predictive information had larger intestines. So these birds that had advance warning basically probably protected the gut during the food restriction so that they had a better assimilation of nutrients. They had a better ability to pull nutrients out of their food and get it into the body. So they could eat the same amount of food, but the amount of nutrients that were actually being brought into the body was probably different because of this small intestine being much larger in the social predictive group. That was really fascinating. And this is not unheard of. Migrant birds change their gut size all the time. So when they're preparing for migration and laying down all that fat, they eat a lot. They have a large gut that is heavy, but it's really good at assimilating nutrients and it allows them to gain mass and get ready for the flight. Then when they fly, they don't eat. The gut is actually digested, and they use that during the flight. The energy that's in the gut, they use that, and it becomes very small and light, but it's not good at that point at assimilating. And so when they land in order to refuel, it actually takes about 2 to 3 days for the gut to rebuild so that they can again gain their mass and prepare for the next leg of the flight. And so you see these pretty short cycles of intestinal growth, digestion, and growth. And we saw that in this experiment with just social cues about what was kind of coming down the pipes in terms of food. So in conclusion, high mobility during resource lows really allows these animals to go find something better. They can allow this rich patch exploiter kind of strategy. Looking within that strategy, stress hormones may be important in decisions about when to go find that better patch, and that social cues are seeming to be very important. And I think this is one of the adaptations that opportunist and flexible species have, is that they are very in tune with social cues. So this allows them to be flexible in breeding, but to still also schedule important survival processes like molt to ensure that you're doing both survival and breeding. And then I've already mentioned this already, but migration, I think in general, is a very responsive trait to learning. Experience seems to be really important. And for this reason, I suspect that migration will be one of the ways that birds really cope with climate change. So before I land on my thank you slide, I just want to mention this group that I've become involved in called the Finch Research Network. And this is the group that is now putting out the winter finch forecast, which seems to be focused a little more on the east, but they're really trying to grow their influence in the west. And so anyway, you might just check it out. They have some cool, t-shirts, and they're trying to support small research projects, and you can be involved in kind of multiple levels in that. So check it out. finchnetwork.org is that.
Great. I have a lot of siskins in my garden right now.
Okay. Yes, I
They
know.
just arrived 3 days ago.
Oh, great. Yeah.
We've got some questions if you're ready.
Yes, sure.
Okay. What type of crossbill do we typically have in the Willamette Valley, and what kind of conifers do they eat?
So the ones that I've heard the most frequently here are actually type 2s have been in the coastal range a lot lately, and they are well known for ponderosa pine, so that's not what they're eating in the coastal range. But they also you find them a lot in Douglas fir and in various kinds of spruces. And so all of the crossbill types have a wide variety of diet that they can feed on. There's been some work where they found that kind of optimal seed intake rates, they might be optimized to a smaller group of conifers. But this kind of habit, I guess, or strategy of calling crossbills particular tree types is, in my mind, a little bit problematic because it biases birders, I think. Oh, that bird is named after the hemlock. If I see a bird in a hemlock, it must be a type 3. So that's another type that's common around here. Type 3s, 4s, and 2s, I'd say, are the most common. 4s are really like Douglas fir and larger spruces. They can also eat pines. And then 3s are the smallest. They are constrained to smaller conifer seeds or cones like spruces and hemlocks and firs. So anyway, that's my 2 cents on the whole kind of naming crossbills after trees. It just bothers me a little bit because I think, for example, the type 5 is found in the Rockies. I have tracked those birds, followed them around a lot, and they survive. They live in the lodgepole. This is the tree that is supposedly their key conifer and that they're named after. But when they breed the most, they're eating blue spruce. That's when they're like explosively breeding blue spruce or Douglas fir. So I just feel like it's really oversimplifying things to say, nope, type 5 is the lodgepole pine bird. That's just not accurate.
Okay. Is anybody tagging crossbills with transmitters that would be picked up by Modus, or are they too small?
They're not too small. We could do it. I don't know anybody that is doing that yet. So I actually am doing a big Modus project in California with shorebirds right now. And I know that involved in that project, there's a lot of Modus towers going up in British Columbia. And so I think the ability to track crossbills with the Modus network is growing because the network is growing in the West.
Okay.
So yeah, I think it's a possibility.
Yeah, I was asking about Modus, about crop, can they attach attachments to crossbills?
For crossbills, is the direction of the upper bill and the lower bill associated with bird type, or is that an individual characteristic?
That's individual, and it's not genetic. Actually, it seems to be it's about 50-50 in the population, and it's kind of like handedness. And I actually think that handedness, which foot the bird prefers to hold a cone with and manipulate a cone with, is probably a big determinant in the bill cross. I had a wildlife rehabber contact me because she had some crossbills that had broken legs, or babies, so that the nest had fallen and some of these babies had injured legs. So she had them nestled in these little like cloth cups, and so they couldn't use their legs. And those birds, their bills grew straight, they didn't cross, and they grew so long that the bird couldn't close their mouth anymore. And so she started taping and pulling the bill over. And what she observed is in the birds that could hold things and could move around normally were spending about a week of their early development doing this obsessive kind of sideways movement with their bills. And she thinks that the birds are behaviorally crossing their bills in a particular direction.
Wow.
That hasn't been tested, but I think it's a really fascinating possibility.
Sure is. And here's a series of comments. Can you distinguish temporal from spatial variability, or how can one be high when the other is low? And it goes on and said, when comparing many different habitats over a large area, is it unpredictability rather than variability?
Yeah, so I think there's both in the crossbill system. I think there's unpredictability in the sense of when the cones will drop their seeds. And there's variability in the sense of where they might find their cone crops. But there's also, I agree. When you think about how are these resources varying across an entire continent, there might be a cone crop somewhere. The birds have to find it. And some years there's cone crops across the whole, you just have this massive cone crops and you get these huge boom years of crossbills producing young. And oftentimes following that year, you get eruptions because there's a lot of birds. And then there's there might be a low cone crop year. And there have been years when I was doing my dissertation, I have to get permits in, 5 different states because I never know where the crossbills are going to be. And there was a year when I had permits for 5 states and I could not find a single fairly large density population of crossbills in the lower 48.
Wow.
They just weren't here. And it's not like they all died, they were somewhere. Some of them probably died in that year. But there's this, so I think there's both. Variability, you could think about it as variability, but on such a big spatial scale that for a tiny bird to find it, there's a lot of unpredictability there. Yeah. I don't know if that answered the question, but that's some of the things. Yeah.
Another comment, chickens sometimes develop crossbills.
Cool.
Is that similar to crossbill the finch?
That I'd be interested to hear more on your observations of that, but I think it's probably a little different. Crossbills, their bills, actually as happened in that this woman's experience, they grow really rapidly, and there's this period of growth where the bill grows fast enough to develop a cross. And that is, and I think also the behavior, even if it is behavioral and the bird is physically pushing the bill over as it grows quickly, even that will be genetically programmed. The birds, that is part of being a crossbill, is to do that. Right. And so I think there's probably differences there, but I'd be interested to hear more about the chicken thing.
A comment just came in saying in chickens it's detrimental. It's not a skill.
Right. Yeah, because then they wouldn't be feeding as well. Exactly. Yeah. But I'm curious as to if anybody knows why it happens and what the underlying reasons are, because sometimes that can be insightful. But with the bill crossing there and chickens, actually, there's some interesting theories about brain laterality and how the chicken embryo was folded in the egg. Usually one eye is up and the other eye is internal to the rest of the body. And so one eye gets more light. And they think that difference between the eye that gets a lot of light and the eye that doesn't actually organizes the brain, and the brain will then develop so that the eye that had a lot of light will be actually have a different kind of tuning spectrum where it'll be more sensitive to movement and the other eye will be more sensitive to detail. And so when you watch birds, a lot of times, depending on the species, they'll look down at something, always with the same eye. And the idea is they're putting the detail eye down on the task, while the eye that's better tuned to movement is up and scanning for predators. And this is something that's been investigated in kind of this divided brain theory of lateralization in the brain. And I'm really curious how that plays out in a crossbill, where you have strong lateralization of behavior and of the bill. But, you know, do they have embryos folding in different directions, and that's what causes that to happen? Or is it something else? And so anyway, that's another possible future direction. There's so many.
Okay. I think we've answered all the questions. Unless anybody's got any more, you can unmute and ask real quickly. If not, I want to thank Jamie. It's been fascinating. Crossbills are always wonderful, even when they just come and go in a quick moment. Is anybody studying this kind of behavior in evening grosbeaks? Do you know?
Well, so I know that there's a big effort to actually tag evening grosbeaks with the MODIS network. So that's going to be happening. I might actually be involved in that effort. We'll see kind of how it develops, but they have not been, at least in the West, they have not been tracked to my knowledge. But I know there's, a lot of concerns about these big declines, especially locally.
Sure.
And I know some finch biologists who I really respect who are unsure that that's really a continent-wide or a species-wide decline. It might just be reflecting more kind of localized movement choices, habitat choices. But it could also be that they are hugely declining. So I just think there probably needs to be more coordinated efforts looking into that.
Right. They're highly nomadic. Well,
Yeah,
thank you again. And in a few minutes, about 4 or 5 minutes, we're going to get back together and we'll do some sharing of sightings recently. And thank you again, doctors.
Yeah, you bet.
Thank you
Thanks
very
a lot.
much.
It was a great program.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Go join the kids at the movie.
Okay. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Isn't she nice and smart?